Convention Center in downtown Washington for the AIPAC conference. This is Norm Brownstein. He's the board member, national board member of AIPAC, making some introductory remarks. We expect tonight to hear from Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, the Minority Leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, and also the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Live coverage now here on C-SPAN 2.
Be able to count on. We'll never need to worry about his commitment. For decades, as a congressman, a senator, and now as majority leader, Harry Reid has been proving Hank right. From helping ensure that Israel receives vital financial aid, to backing Israel's right to protect its citizens, to holding the Palestinian leadership accountable for terrorism. Harry clearly understands the threat posed by a nuclear Iran, and he has played a key role in advancing sanctions legislation aimed at depriving this rogue regime of the funds it needs to pursue atomic arms. So please join me tonight in welcoming a man who for more than 2 decades has been willing to step into the ring and fight to the finish in support of the U.S. Israel relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, my good friend, our good friend, Senator Harry Reid, Majority Leader of the United States Senate.
Norm, thank you very much. I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate the introduction. I'm also grateful to my friend Harriet Zimmerman. And I, of course, would be remiss if I didn't mention my partner, Shelley Berkeley. There's no policy organization in the country with the grassroots power of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And the subject for which this organization advocates, the safety and security of Israel, could not be more important. Tonight's program is another testament to the absolute necessity of AIPAC and to the support this organization enjoys from the entire Congress. Over the last 3 months, Senator McConnell and I, in our roles as Senate Majority and Minority Leaders, have had our public disagreements. But when it comes to the peace, security, and freedom of Israel, we stand side by side. In the course of history, the people of Israel have traveled a long, difficult road toward freedom. This road toward freedom contains inspiring memories, inspiring testimonies like those of Mordecai and Tamar Klein. These survivors of Dachau and Auschwitz are the parents of Abner Klein. Abner, a member of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department SWAT team, is frequently assigned to my security detail when I travel home to Nevada. I had the pleasure of spending the day with Abner's parents when I visited Israel last year. They're remarkable individuals whose story of survival symbolizes what Israel is all about. The road toward freedom is also filled with stories like that of Helen Arkady Mai. Helen was a Russian refusenik who I first met in the Soviet Union almost 25 years ago. She was a surrogate of Nathan Sharansky, and as a result, this tough, courageous woman and her husband faced persecution in the former Soviet Union. Even though Arkady is now deceased, their life's dream, living in Israel, has been fulfilled. Sadly, this road toward freedom, though for many has required, if not most, great sacrifice. On my last visit to Israel, I made a special visit to Jerusalem's renowned Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem. There my wife, Landra, and I were able to learn the fate of her father's family, the Goldfarbs. Landra's father, Israel or Earl Goldfarb, immigrated from the city of Novgorod, Ukraine, in the early 1900s. Unfortunately, the Goldfarbs that remained suffered a much different fate than my father-in-law. Along with millions of others, 7 Goldfarbs from Novgorod were killed by the Nazis, and their names have been listed in Yad Vashem's Book of Martyrs and Heroes. Tonight, the road traveled by Israel Goldfarb, the grandfather of my children, who by virtue of their mother's lineage are eligible for Israeli citizenship. The road traveled by Helen Mai, the road traveled by the Kleins. That road is still open. The people of Israel still move forward, but on their journey they do not travel alone. In their quest for freedom, in their quest for liberty, in their quest for peace, the Israeli people have no stronger friend than the United States of America. Together we continue the fight against tyranny and terrorism and fight for the common values for which we both stand. Let me be clear. Threats to Israel's security have not diminished, despite the country's continued commitment to peace. Let me be clear. Israel's security is constantly in danger. The threat of violence is real. Last summer, the world watched in horror as violence flared again, when Hezbollah lobbed hundreds of rockets at helpless Israeli citizens. It was another reminder that Israel's right to live in peace is not a reality. Let me be clear. Israel's neighbor to the north, Lebanon, has been overrun by extremists seeking to harm Israel. We all must do what we can to support a democratic Lebanon that seeks peace. However, Hezbollah must be shown for what it really is, a terrorist organization. With regard to the Palestinians, a two-state solution is in the interest of all parties, and I hope that Israelis and Palestinians can soon resume a real negotiating process. But never, no, never should the State of Israel contract with the Palestinians unless all their government, Hamas included, recognizes the sovereignty of Israel and agrees to stop fomenting violence. All members of a Palestinian government must be committed to nonviolence, recognition of Israel, and acceptance of previous agreements and obligations, including the roadmap. Every United States president and every United States Congress since World War II has fought to bring freedom, stability, and prosperity to the Middle East. As Israel knows all too well, the war on terror did not begin on 9/11, but decades earlier. This struggle will be with us for years to come. It is a struggle of moderates against extremism that we, the United States, Israel, and our friends must and will win. We see the difficulty of this struggle in Iraq today. You heard earlier from the Vice President who said we must succeed in Iraq. I could not agree more. We will stand with the Iraqi people to stabilize their country and ensure security in the Middle East. But I submit the current course in Iraq is leading to failure. A strategy that costs America more than $8 billion a month is not making us safer and is playing right into the hands of Osama bin Laden Al-Qaeda, and their allies. The war is plunging the Middle East deeper into instability and insecurity. To stay stubbornly on the current course is to increase the chances of a strategic defeat for our country, the United States. To win in Iraq, there must be a change of course, and that is why we'll continue to push in Congress. Regrettably, the longer Iraq remains destabilized, the more it emboldens Iran. Iran continues to thumb its nose at the United States and the world. It must not be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. The world must stay unified in condemning Iran's march toward nuclear weapons. The UN Security Council has approved sanctions, but these sanctions must be implemented, and the world community must keep pressure on Iran. Iran, you see, is a very mixed bag. They have a young population yearning for liberalism and democracy, a population that has repeatedly demonstrated its desire for freedom in the polling booth. But Iran also has a theocratic oligarchy committed to repressing these yearnings. The two cannot forever coexist. Eventually, the theocratic revolution of the 1970s must recognize reality and accede to the wishes of the Iranian people, or it must devour both its young and itself. Totalitarian rule is inconsistent with progress. The Iranian people know this. Their government bureaucracy knows this, at least in part. Their president, their intelligence apparatus, and their mullahs will have to learn it in one fashion or another. The revolution does not always devour its young. Sometimes the young devour the revolution. There's a powerful lesson to learn in the yearnings of Iran's younger generation, a lesson that extends throughout the Middle East. Young people present a great opportunity for progress. They can be the catalyst for change if they do not first learn to hate. I am appalled that many in the Middle East, countries we consider allies, continue to promote anti-Semitism in their societies and in their schools. They profess peace, but teach their children to hate. We should have a zero tolerance toward this practice. How can a country be called an ally of the United States if they're giving their children anti-Semitic propaganda? The battle of ideas for the hearts and minds is every bit as important as the battle we wage with guns and war. As Ariel Sharon told us, the sword alone cannot decide this bitter dispute. I personally have fond memories of Ariel Sharon. This man who continues to struggle for his life has had such a profound impact on all of us. I remember traveling to Israel in August of 2001. There I met Sharon, then in the minority, and that's to say the least, in Tel Aviv. He spent 2 hours with me, a single United States senator, going over map after map after map, intelligence report after intelligence report. He had, the idea that he someday would be prime minister. I didn't think he would. I was wrong. Ariel Sharon was right. It's because of men and women like Sharon and Barak and Netanyahu and Perez and Rabin and Shamir and Begin and Meir and Eshkol and Sharet and Ben-Gurion that the people of Israel have come so far in this long road of Israel history. There's a well-known saying, when the cannons roar, the muses are silent. A similar idea was expressed a long time ago by Cicero when he said, during war, the laws are silent. These sayings are regrettable. They reflect neither the existing law nor the desirable law. It is when the cannons roar that we especially need the laws. Every struggle of the state against terrorism or any other enemy must be conducted according to rules and law. There is always law which the state must comply. There are no black holes. There are no black holes. That quotation from a recent Supreme Court decision is one I admire. I respect it for its content, for its high idealism, and for its fundamental commitment to the core values of democracy. This profound decision was issued in December of 2006 in a case called the Public Committee Against Torture versus the State. I admire it so much that it was issued by the Israeli Supreme Court. That devotion by the State of Israel, not just to lip service, but to the actual application of the law, is one reason I so appreciate and support Israel's continuing struggle for peace and justice. Faced with insolvable dilemmas, caught between the compelling needs of security and openness, of force and negotiation, of the public happiness and the public safety, Israel has served as a beacon for the rule of law over the power of men. It is what we in the United States have in common with our friends and allies in Israel. Our nations both represent the shining city on a hill, the beacon to nations and the light of the world. Together we, Israel and the United States, must do whatever it takes to keep that beacon shining strong in the face of terrorism and violence. Together, the Congress and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee will strive to fuel the light of freedom glowing here in America and in faraway Israel. That is my commitment, and I know it's yours. Thank you and good night. Thanks, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome AIPAC National Board Member, Mayor Mitchell.
Good evening. Have I made a difference? It's a question that many of us asked ourselves, particularly as we advance in age. And for me, it is a question that has become persistent and the answer more important in a year of personal health difficulties. As I stand before you today, I am proud to say that I've tried to make a difference. And each and every one of you can make a difference in many, many ways. Israel needs you more than ever, so stay involved and encourage others to join you in our efforts. More than 22 years ago, I met an up-and-coming elected official from Kentucky named Mitch McConnell. I was an AIPAC activist from Mobile, Alabama, which has a small Jewish community of less than 1,200 people, and the state of Alabama, which has less than 9,000. Mitch had just finished his first campaign for Senate, defeating a two-term incumbent, and I, having a company that operated in 10 southeastern states, I was aware of the growing trend of our area of the country to elect Republican senators. And I knew that AIPAC did not have a good relationship in that particular area. Therefore, I undertook establishing a relationship with Senator Mitch McConnell. Our friendship and the time that we've spent together discussing the U.S. Israel relationship turned out to be an important way in which I made a difference. For the past 22 years, and now today, as Republican Senate leader, Mitch McConnell has been making a difference. His work has affected so many of the people and issues that you and I care so deeply about. As a leader of the Senate Foreign Operations Subcommittee, He has always ensured that Israel receives the vital assistance that it needs. He understands that an investment in Israel's future and security is an investment in America's future and security. Through the years, Senator McConnell has supported dozens of pieces of legislation affecting the U.S. Israel relationship. This past year, he was the chief sponsor of the Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act, an important bill that cuts all but humanitarian aid to the Palestinians until they accept Israel's right to exist, renounce terror and violence, and accept all previous agreements with Israel. In recognition of his extraordinary leadership on the issues involving the U.S. Israel relationship, Senator McConnell recently received an honorary degree from the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. During that ceremony, he stated that America's support for a strong and secure Israel will never waver. Senator McConnell, because of your incredible commitment, our community's respect, support, and admiration for you will never waver. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my good friend, a man who has been making a difference in the United States Senate on behalf of Israel for over 22 years, the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell.
Well, thank you, Bubba, for that wonderful, warm introduction. As Bubba indicated, we've been friends for a long time, and Israel certainly has no better friend than Bubba Mitchell. Bubba and I were both born in Alabama, and we take more than a mild interest in college football. My Cardinals beat his Crimson Tide in a bowl game 16 years ago, and I doubt if I'll ever get tired of reminding him of it. We share a mild interest in politics, too. They don't come any better than Bubba Mitchell. For more than half a century, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee has worked hard to promote the security and welfare of Israel. It represents Israel's interests with energy and intelligence, and always with a deep appreciation for the strong bonds that connect the U.S. with our closest ally in the Middle East. Lawmakers depend on AIPAC for good, honest information, and that's exactly what we've gotten. We admire and share your devotion to the Jewish people, and we appreciate the vital role you play in protecting and advancing their rights. In recent years, AIPAC has played another important role. It helped America deal effectively with a constant threat of terror. And we're grateful for the counsel and friendship as we face this new and difficult challenge. The last time I spoke at this conference was back in 1988. It was easy for me to remember the year because it was only 3 years later that my Cardinals beat Bubba's Crimson Tide in the Fiesta Bowl. That was a joke, Bubba. No, I remember the year and the speech very well because my friend and former law partner, Barney Barnett, had just passed away, and I remember asking myself what he would have told me to say if he were alive. Barney was Jewish, he was a member of AIPAC, and he was a proud son of Kentucky. So proud I once heard him say, "There's only one race greater than the Jews, and that's the Derby." Now, Barney was a plain-spoken guy, and his advice would have been blunt. So I figured he would have said something like, "They don't know you. They'll be suspicious of you. Don't go up there and be another politician looking for applause." I took that imagined advice and told him of how this Southern Baptist became so interested in Israel. I talked about growing up in Alabama and how the only Jewish man in town was Mr. Jaffe, and how, looking back, it was clear to me that Mr. Jaffe was in the same category as the local Republican, singular. Unlike most Southern towns back then, we actually had a Republican Party, but he died when I was 8. I talked about, back in 1988, why I'd want to speak to AIPAC in the first place. After all, there weren't many Jewish voters in Kentucky. I'd been to Israel twice. The first time back in 1979, before I came to the Senate, was significant because at that point in my life, a trip to Nashville seemed like international travel. But as a child, I never witnessed bigotry against Jews. I didn't know any. I didn't even know Mr. Jaffe. But the fact is, the more I got engaged in politics, the better acquainted I became with the issues related to Israel. And somewhere along the line, I came to understand what people call the Jewish experience. Came to appreciate the pain of being rootless, of being, as Chaim Weizmann put it, a minority everywhere, a majority nowhere. I came to understand that what Weizmann meant when he said the Jewish people had carried Palestine around in their heads and their hearts wherever they went. The whole idea was brought home to me many years ago when someone handed me a newspaper article written by an American Jew. He said something very powerful that stuck with me. He said that at some point, no matter how close he was to his non-Jewish friends, he couldn't help but wonder, would they hide me in the attic? It was a revealing comment, and it was unsettling to read. No American should ever have to ask themselves that question. But the fact that Jewish Americans were still asking it reflected just how painful their history has been. I knew then that I'd always be an ally of Israel. And over the next 24 years, I would try to show it in the policies I supported, and for more than a dozen years in my work either as chairman or ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations. It was largely because of the work of that subcommittee that the Weizmann Institute of Science gave me an honorary doctorate a few years ago. It was a great honor, especially for a guy who didn't do all that well in science. And it was a great pleasure to visit Israel again, this time with my great friend and AIPAC stalwart, Bob Asher of Chicago. I remember a real sense of optimism on that trip. Yasser Arafat had just passed away, and a lot of us were hopeful that the Palestinian people would embrace a new direction. I was always of the view that Arafat was no friend to America or to Israel, and that he was really never interested in peace. Unfortunately, last year's Palestinian elections proved that my hopes were misplaced. Hamas, emergent as the leading voice in Palestinian affairs, sobered peace-loving people everywhere. Congress has responded to the new political reality. I was pleased to help lead the charge in the Senate to put pressure on Hamas to block U.S. aid for Hamas-led Palestinian Authority unless it acknowledged Israel's right to exist. Committed itself to prior agreements, instituted financial transparency, and began to dismantle its terrorist infrastructure. As a result of the Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act, which holds the Hamas-led Palestinian Authority to these standards as a condition of U.S. aid, so far, the Hamas-led government has met none of those conditions. It's given no indication that it plans to. Direct foreign aid is not an entitlement, and unless the Hamas-led Palestinian Authority meets these basic demands, it will not get a dime from us. And while you're on your feet, the so-called unity government has to meet the same standard. Our hopes for progress were frustrated again last summer by the Iranian-backed aggressions of Hezbollah. The existence of extra-governmental groups like Hezbollah and Hamas only make diplomacy between Israel and the countries that border it more difficult. Hezbollah is camped on the border to antagonize Israel. Lebanon has shown neither the will nor the ability to control it, and no one should question Israel's right to defend itself from so close and deadly a threat. Now, anyone who's been to Israel, and most of you have, knows the danger. I remember visiting an Israeli business on my last trip. You could see right into Lebanon from the roof. But what struck me wasn't the view. What struck me were the armed soldiers keeping watch at lookout posts across the way. They were standing not under the flag of Lebanon, but under the flag of Hezbollah. Right there along the border, in force, was a terrorist group that claimed hundreds of American and Israeli lives. For decades, Americans were sympathetic but distant observers of Israel's experience with terror. We were shocked when we visited and saw terrorists lined up along its borders or metal detectors at malls. We shared its grief from a distance when we heard of terrorists slaughtering children in markets and on buses. We were moved when Prime Minister Rabin came to Washington to tell us of a land where parents bury their children. We grew accustomed to the notion that terrorism was distant, accustomed in a way that Israel never could be. From the War of Independence to the Suez War, from the Six-Day War to the Yom Kippur War, from the First Lebanon War to the First and Second Intifadas, up until the Second Lebanon War, Israel's history was a period of war interrupted by flashes of peace. Its back was to the wall through all of this, and it's shown remarkable resilience against a parade of enemies who seem motivated not so much by a desire for riches or lands as by hatred of the race. We observed all this from over here, and we were astonished and proud to see Israel thrive. The Jewish people have earned the admiration of the world by turning their age-old admonition to repair the world on themselves, by reclaiming a narrow stretch of arid land that Mark Twain once described as a silent, mournful expanse, and transforming it in mere decades into a vibrant, verdant place through the faith, hard work, and brilliance of its people. Today, Israel exports tulips to Holland. And to think that it started from scratch, surrounded by enemies. No country has ever come farther faster. Israel has shown the world that open and democratic people who are sensitive to human losses can defeat fanatical militias with no allegiance to state and no appreciation for life, not even their own. And it is in this challenge, new to America, that our two nations are once again joined. This alliance goes back to the beginning, but it's stronger now than ever. America was the first nation to recognize Israel, sealing a bond that grew out of a common form of government, a pioneering spirit, and a shared commitment to religious freedom. That bond deepened as Israel became an open democracy in the heart of a region that had never known one. It deepened further in the Cold War as Israel stood with us and against the Soviet Union and the nationalist regimes that sympathized with it. And it deepened further still on 9/11. An alliance once based on shared political and moral values was now cemented by a shared commitment to confront a global movement of Islamic extremists that targeted us both for destruction. Suddenly, America found itself asking the same question the Jewish people have asked themselves for millennia. It's the question of the second Psalm. Why do nations conspire against us and the peoples plot in vain? We turn to Israel for advice, and we've gotten it. Israel's successful efforts to learn from its enemies, to infiltrate their networks and learn their languages are a model for us. If done correctly, this work will take years, but the effects will be worthwhile. As Lao Tzu wrote, know your enemies and know yourself, and you will not be defeated in 100 battles. The war on terror continues, and the central front is Iraq. This is what the terrorists themselves have said. Al-Qaeda's hope is to force a withdrawal of U.S. troops so as to claim victory, just as Hezbollah did last summer after last summer's war with Israel. And leaving Iraq to the terrorists would have grave consequences for Iraq, for the region, for Israel, and for the world. For the sake of the Iraqi people and their neighbors, we must not retreat from this fight. Iran's support for terrorists in Iraq is well known, and the anti-American and anti-Semitic rhetoric of its president is only the latest convergence of interest between America and Israel. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has made no secret of his plans for regional dominance and for Israel, its destruction. He closed his recent state-sponsored Holocaust denial conference by declaring that the Zionist regime will be wiped out and humanity will be liberated. Anyone who calls the Holocaust a fairy tale does not intend to recognize the state of Israel. And anyone who is sitting on the world's second largest oil and natural gas reserves is not pursuing nuclear technology to heat homes. He will weaponize it. Churchill said, facts are better than dreams. These are the facts. Those are his dreams. The last time I spoke to AIPAC, Israel was closer to Camp David Accords than America was to September the 11th. There was good reason to think peace was possible, maybe even right around the corner. But when Arafat walked away from the two-state solution offered him in 2000, after 9/11, we came to see that the antagonists of Israel and the U.S. want more than territory. Those of us who were on Capitol Hill last week were reminded that Israel is not alone among its neighbors in the desire for peace. King Abdullah's speech before a joint session of Congress reminded us that there are other constructive voices in the region. Like many of you, I admire King Abdullah, and I was encouraged by his passionate and urgent appeal for peace. So we remain hopeful, and we've become more clear-eyed about the obstacles and the stakes. That 1988 speech was, in one way, right on target. I pointed out a number of threats to Israel that have only increased with time. But I was wrong about one thing. I was wrong to suggest that the enemies of Israel threaten to sap its strength. The Israelis are nothing if not resilient. And in this, there is another lesson for America. And the lesson for America is this: the war on terror will not be quick. To some, it already seems too long. We can learn from the Israelis what it means to be determined in the fight. And as we do, my hope is that the alliance that has bound us together will become a sign to others that freedom and hope are the greatest weapons against oppression and fear. Now, some see the strong relationship between America and Israel as evidence of a plot. They don't appreciate the bonds that connect us. Most Americans support Israel because the qualities they admire in Israel are the qualities they admire in themselves: openness, courage, resolve. Some of the conspiracy theorists go so far as to equate the terrorists with the struggles of Americans during the colonial period. They call terrorism resistance and seek to admire it. But women and children are not slaughtered for a noble cause, and people who seek freedom do not rejoice at the death of their own. George Washington once offered this prayer for the Jewish people in a young America: may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while every one shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. This is the prayer of Americans still for the Jewish people here and everywhere else. And we feel a crushing sense of responsibility until that prayer is answered. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back AIPAC Chair of the Board, Bernice Menacherian.
It's the middle of the night in Israel, and the Prime Minister was asleep. And he had to be awakened, and he's moving a little more slowly than we anticipated. So I am going to start my remarks with my grand finale and my announcements for tomorrow morning. The doors, first of all, we will be joined by Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and House Republican Leader John Boehner. The doors will open at 8:15. We will not have breakfast here, so please have your breakfast beforehand. At this time, well, all delegates should not at this time report to the front of the plenary. I'm sorry. We hope okay. Now we all have to be a little patient and hope the Prime Minister will join us very shortly. Do we have any information? Not yet. I wish I could sing and dance.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of Israel will be joining us shortly.
Well, so far it's been a marvelous conference. I'm sure you'll all agree with me. You all understand that the current situation in Israel demands the Prime Minister's full attention. It was impossible for him to be with us here tonight in person, but he didn't want to miss this opportunity to speak to the hundreds of policymakers and thousands of AIPAC activists gathered here to celebrate the U.S. Israel relationship. So, if he was willing to be awakened in the middle of the night to speak to us via satellite, we have to be a little patient, and he will be with us shortly. So talk to each other.
So we're looking at a live picture from the Convention Center in downtown Washington, the AIPAC conference. What's going on right now? We're waiting for a satellite feed with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Actually, this event running a little bit ahead of schedule, that rare event here in Washington, and waiting for the satellite feed to get hooked up to bring remarks from the Prime Minister of Israel. As we wait, a quick program note for you. Tomorrow morning on C-SPAN, our program Washington Journal underway at 7 a.m. with a look at the day's headlines and some of your phone calls. Then at 7:30, it'll be Representative Lynn Woolsey, the California Democrat and the co-founder of the Out of Iraq Caucus, talking about Iraq war funding. She'll be followed at 8 o'clock Eastern Time by Representative Roger Wicker, the Mississippi Republican and Defense Appropriations Subcommittee member, talking about the same subject of war funding for the war in Iraq. Then at 9 o'clock, we'll have Clark Kent Irvin from the Aspen Institute, the Homeland Security Initiative Director there, talking about Homeland Security funding grants and why the 9/11 Commission recommended Congress change that formula that provides money to states. We'll have more of him and your phone calls tomorrow morning on Washington Journal in the 9 o'clock hour. And we'll finish up the program tomorrow with Harold Scheberger, the International Association of Firefighters president, talking about the role of unions in campaigns. It all gets underway at 7 Eastern on our companion network, C-SPAN.
Gentlemen, please welcome back Bernice Menacherian.
Well, this has been an interesting evening. This past year has been one which has demanded leadership. Shh. A war provoked by the terrorist army Hezbollah, unrest and attacks emanating from a Hamas-led Palestinian Authority, and a regime in Iran defying the world by pushing ahead toward a nuclear weapons capability. Indeed, the many challenges that Ehud Olmert has been obliged to face during his brief time as Prime Minister remind us of Israel's precarious position and the lightning-fast speed with which Israel must be prepared to defend herself. Mr. Prime Minister, we applaud your courage, and we stand with you as you confront these challenges and press forward to achieve a secure and peaceful future for Israel. We will be with you, working to ensure that America always stands with Israel. All of us gathered here would also like to express our prayer that the 3 kidnapped Israeli soldiers, Gilad Shalit, Eldad Regev, and Ehud Goldwasser, are soon returned home safely to their families. Our hearts go out to all of them. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great honor to introduce, live via satellite from Jerusalem, the Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bernice, for your beautiful words. Thank you for the introduction. Chairman Howard Kaplan and Vice President, the Executive Vice President, the famous Howard Corr, the members of the boards of AIPAC, the Honorable Ambassador of the State of Israel to the United States, my dear personal friend Salai Meridor, who just came few weeks ago to America and is already well known all over the capital, and members of Congress, supporters of the State of Israel, and 1,000 members of AIPAC that came from across America all the way to this very unusual annual meeting in Washington. To all of you, I say, I am so happy and delighted, even though it's now 4 a.m. in the morning in Jerusalem. But I say to myself, how can I miss this powerful, inspiring, so exciting and moving event, even when I'm not in Washington? I had the privilege of doing it so many times in the past, from that podium where you stand now, Bernice. And I say to myself, I'm not going to lose this one only because I'm here in Jerusalem. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak at 4 a.m. in the morning from Jerusalem and share with you some thoughts and concerns and fears and hopes that we have for the State of Israel and the Jewish people. First of all, thank you for AIPAC, for the ever-ending support of AIPAC for the State of Israel, but also for being one of the most powerful vehicles of improving and upgrading the great relations that exist between the State of Israel and the United States of America. I want to speak tonight about two major issues. First and foremost, the threats that come to Israel from Iran. Iran is the main threat to the State of Israel. There has never been such a brutal, explicit, and direct threat to the very existence of the State of Israel by any nation since Israel was proclaimed, as today is the threat of Iran to the very life of our country. This is the first time since the Second World War that a leader of a nation, member of the United Nations, stands up publicly and explicitly and talks about the liquidation of the State of Israel. Not only this, but this country is creating a very sophisticated weaponry system with ballistic missiles that can deliver bombs to the very heart of the State of Israel, as well as to the very heart of many European cities and many other major cities across the world. But not only this country tries to create nuclear capacity. And they explicitly and publicly and brutally talk about the need to write Israel off the map. Not since the Second World War did we hear such words coming from a leader of a nation against another nation. And you people gathered here in Washington tonight, you know that when it comes to this, when we hear such threats, we lose our sense of humor. We take it seriously. We have no choice but to take it seriously. And we must address ourselves to these threats and make sure that no one really has the capacity, the means, and the opportunity to exercise their hatred against the Jewish people and the State of Israel particularly not those who might have nuclear capacity. Naturally, the preferred solution for the Iranian issue is a diplomatic one. Israel is very much in favor of diplomatic approach that can be useful and that can be helpful. Sanctions which were already taken by the UN resolutions 1737 and hopefully additional measures which will have to be taken soon by countries across the world, economic measures, diplomatic measures, political measures, will all be effective and will be felt and will help to force the Iranians to reconsider their position and to decide whether it's worthwhile for them to carry on this challenge without additional restraint. But at the end of the day, I think we all know, and we have to recognize it, that President George W. Bush is the only leader, and the United States of America is the only country that can be of enormous influence on what the Iranians will do. They are the only ones that can confront effectively the aggressiveness of the Iranians in their attempts to build up nuclear capacity. I know that all of you, friends of the State of Israel, well-wishers for the State of Israel, all of you who are concerned about the security and the future of the State of Israel, understand the importance of strong American leadership addressing the Iranian threat. And I am sure that you will not hamper or restrain that strong leadership unnecessarily. I also want to add what might be the consequences of premature action in Iraq. What these might create to Israel's security, to the security of the Gulf states, to the stability in the Middle East, and to the ability of the United States to cope with threats emerging in different parts of the world, particularly those threats emerging from Iran. Now let me be very sincere and very open with you. All of you are friends of the State of Israel, and all of you care deeply for the security and the well-being and the future of the State of Israel. And I'm sure that all of you are willing to support efforts made by Israel, the United States, and other nations in order to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power. I don't want to enter into American politics. Believe me, I have enough politics of my own back home, and that's quite a lot, sometimes too much. All I care about is Israel's security and its well-being. And therefore, not out of my personal friendship to President Bush, not any involvement or interest in American politics, just out of this deep concern for the future of the State of Israel, that I have to say to you that any outcome that will not help America's strengths and would, in the eyes of the people in the region, undercut America's ability to deal effectively with the threat posed by the Iranian regime will be very negative for those who love the State of Israel and for those who care for the ability of the State of Israel and other nations in the region to cope with the problems coming from Iran. Those who are concerned for Israel's security, for the security of the Gulf states, and for the stability of the entire Middle East should recognize the need for American success in Iraq and responsible actions there. Now, my dear friends, let me say a couple of words about the Palestinian situation. The other day I met with President Mahmoud Abbas, who was a guest in my home here in Jerusalem. We had a very candid and friendly talk. And I told him that regardless of political circumstances, and as long as he is the leader, the elected leader of the Palestinian people, I will continue my strategic cooperation with him because I want to maintain a link to the Palestinian people. But at the same time, I said what all of the civilized world said, including America and of course Europe, that a unity government amongst the Palestinians, based on Hamas, that will not recognize the four principles of the Quartet, will not be recognized by the State of Israel. We will not cooperate with the Hamas government, and we will not recognize or work on a daily basis with ministers who are members of a Hamas government, regardless of the affiliation of some of the ministers, whether they are Hamas or Fatah or any other organization. A Hamas government, any Palestinian government must recognize the Quartet's principles, must release Corporal Shalit without any conditions, must stop the unending rocket Qassam shooting on the innocent Israelis in the south part of our country, and must work on the basis of principles of human decency, of patience, of tolerance, and of friendship, which is the way in which we relate to the Palestinian government. These are not easy times, but we still expect very much that all of the international community will continue to establish their policies with regard to the Middle East on the basis of the agreed principles of the Quartet, which were the guidelines for the policies of those countries for the last year in the Middle East. And of course, I want to take this opportunity also to express our deep thanks and appreciation and respect for the role that the United States administration, President Bush, and Secretary Rice play in the politics of the Middle East. I know how complex it is, I know how difficult it is, I know how sensitive it is. How grateful we are to you, President, and to you, Secretary Rice, for your involvement, for your care, for your friendship, for your support, that keeps the hope for a future Middle East with the possibility of a peace process still alive. We will continue to be partners in these efforts to advance peace and negotiations and recognition between us and the Palestinians, alive with great chances of moving things forward. And finally, my dear friends, let me thank all of you. You know how much we love you, and you know how much we thank you for your friendship. You know how much we appreciate the friendship, the involvement, and the concern of so many important congressmen from across the aisle, the two sides in American politics, who are united in their support and in their dedication and in their convictions as far as Israel is concerned. And how grateful we are to you, members of AIPAC, the most powerful Jewish organization in the world, which entirely and exclusively is dedicated to the well-being of the State of Israel and the Jewish people. And I want to thank all of you members of the board, all of the activists, all of those who come now from across America, from one side to the other, leave everything behind them and come to Washington so that everyone will know that this tiny state of Israel does have representatives who care so deeply, who are ready to act so much, and who are so involved in everything that happens to us. And again, I want to thank to the Israeli ambassador in Washington, Salai Meridor, and you, powerful, dynamic, influential, knowledgeable, and well-liked by everyone, the new ambassador of Israel, Salai Meridor. And I now understand also that my dear colleague and partner and friend, the Minister of Defense of the State of Israel, Mr. Amir Peretz, is with us here in this hall tonight. Amir Peretz is my partner, and I am very happy to recognize you, my dear friend, to be here tonight and to feel directly in your presence there the warmth, the friendship, the support that we have with such great friends in America. Thank you all for your friendship. I want to thank again President Bush and Secretary Rice and Vice President Cheney and the American leadership and the American Congress for their support of the State of Israel. When America is strong, Israel is strong. When America succeeds in Iraq, Israel is safer in Israel. When America is strong in coping with the terrorists in Iraq, Israel is in a better position to cope with the threats that come from Iran. The friends of Israel know it. The friends who care for Israel know it. The friends who are worried about the future of the State of Israel want that America will be successful, want that America will be strong, and I wish the administration that will keep the American presence strong and powerful and convincing so that everyone will know that this is the only way to deal with the threats that might be posed against America and American friends in that part of the world. On this note, I want to thank you all and to hope to be able to see some of you in the State of Israel. Let me tell you, this is the most beautiful period now in the life of our country. It's the new spring starting to spread all over the place. And wherever you go, you can see the beauty of Israel. And particularly here in Jerusalem, you can see the beauty and you smell the beauty of history and the beauty and the glory of the city of Jerusalem. So, I'm taking now a great challenge. I want, on behalf of the State of Israel, to invite each and every one of you, members of AIPAC, supporters of AIPAC, congressmen, ambassadors, friends from all over, please come to Israel and be my personal guests. And you'll feel safe, and you'll enjoy it, and you'll share in the glory of Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for joining us at this ungodly hour. We look forward to continuing to work with you to strengthen the ties between the United States and Israel. But for you now, you should really go back to sleep.
Thank you very much, Bernice.
And thank you, sir. I have one more announcement for the students, so please don't leave, but that concludes the programming for everyone else. My information is left backstage. Wait a moment, students.
At this time, all student delegates should report to the front of the plenary hall and gather near the stage for the official 2007 Policy Conference Student Delegate Portrait. All student delegates, please report to the front of the plenary hall and gather near the stage for the official portrait right now. Thank you all very much.
Live coverage of the AIPAC Legislative Conference taking place here in Washington. The Senate today continued work on a bill that would implement the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. Up next, more about that bill from